Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Wednesday the 15th. And believe it or not, we are getting close to the end of the semester. So at this particular point, you should have done two speeches. The first being an autobiographical speech, 5 minutes to get yourself acquainted with the idea of speaking in front of an audience while you record yourself. And then our second speech, the informative speech, 10 minutes, where you get to teach the audience something. You probably noted that that is a little bit more complex because you probably don't know the material as well as you would know the material from the autobiographical speech. So that means that the outline is essential and also practice is essential so that you can maintain things like eye contact and vocal inflections. And now we are talking about our third and final speech. That is the persuasive speech, and you can see in the notes below that is going to be due on Tuesday, the 21st, because Monday, the 20th, is a holiday, Martin Luther King Day, so we are not meeting. And in fact, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below to section 4, course outline. I wanted to lay out where we are for the rest of the semester. That what we will be doing on Thursday, the 16th, is that you will have a third quiz, very similar to what you did with quiz 1 and quiz 2. And if any of you wanted to have any optional practice sessions, you could so do so, because on Friday, the 17th, we've been doing very well in terms of how things have been going with time. I have that listed as a catch-up class, and it looks like we will be able to use it in that way so that you can prepare basically for your persuasive speech, which is probably the most challenging of the speeches. And also, this is when I'm going to ask you to submit in your peer feedback for the informative speech. Now, I've been suggesting a 24-hour deadline. I'm going to give you 48 hours in this particular respect. And again, the hope is that you can watch all of the speeches within that time period. But if you need an extension, please contact me. It's important to try to get within that time period because what I'm going to be doing is gathering all of that information, getting it ready to present to you, which I've already done with speech number 1. So you would have seen in our Moodle notes that what I did was I listed a commonly cited strength and a commonly cited weakness for each of you from all of the peer feedback that I had received. And that peer feedback counts as, in effect, your attendance question for that particular day. So if we were to have no class on the 17th, and you would have up until the 17th to submit in peer feedback for the informative speech, that gives us a long weekend because Monday is the 20th, Martin Luther King Day, no classes. And then on the 21st, which is Tuesday, you would be posting speech number 3, the persuasive speech, which I'll talk about in a moment. And our class ends on the 22nd, which is Wednesday. When you have quiz number 4, keep in mind that I dropped the lowest quiz grade. So if it turns out you missed a quiz or if you didn't perform well on a quiz, that's what quiz number 4 is about. But if it turns out that you've done well on your first 3 quizzes, you can elect not to take quiz number 4, and that would be the quiz in which that you ultimately drop. This is also when you're going to have to hand in some persuasive speech peer reviews, much like you've done with the informative speech, much like you've done with the autobiographical speech, one strength, one weakness, and then I can share that with you on Moodle. And then we're done with the semester. So let me talk a little bit about the persuasive speech where you have 15 minutes this time. And I'm going to ask you to use 3 outside sources. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about using outside sources in a previous class in the event that you wanted to use an outside source or multiple outside sources for the informative speech, but not required. What you are required to do with the informative speech is basically use an audio or visual. I stopped counting after 1. And the persuasive speech, what you're required to do is to use 3 outside sources. I stopped counting after 3, so you can use as many as you like after that. And you can use any combination. So if you wanted to use all websites, that's fine. Remember, we talked a little bit about the advantages of using the GCC library, especially the GCC library database system, so that you can get more accurate information. We talked a little bit about making sure that you are letting your audience know when you are using information that is not yours, and that documenting that is not as perhaps complex as something that you might find in a written paper, though you should certainly have the same information available in the event that an audience member were to ask you for that information. But basically, all I'm asking is that you list information about your sources on the speaking outline that you're going to submit to me. And you can put it in any format that you liked. We talked a little bit about the MLA, Modern Language Association. They have a particular set of rules about how to organize information about author and publisher and place of publication. Slightly different for the APA, the American Psychological Association. I want to try to make this as useful for you as possible in a real world situation. So in a real world situation, particularly a face-to-face situation, you certainly wouldn't want to burden your audience with all of the minutia of your outside sources. But you do want to be able to be clear when you are giving your speech what information is yours and what is not. So this is where you usually give something like a tag, where you're just generally stating according to experts, or perhaps you're giving a little bit more information so it's clear to your audience when you are not citing or when you are citing information that is not yours. And then at the ending of the speech, if you were asked to provide that information, you could provide that information, that you would have it written down somewhere. So again, what I'm going to ask that you do is that you share that information with me via your speaking outline. And the idea behind the persuasive speech is that you are selecting a topic about something that can be debated. It's not a fact. So the idea is that reasonable people could disagree about it. However, think about how all of the 3 speeches could be connected, and that you gave an autobiographical speech and you probably mentioned things of interest to you. And one of those things might have been an appropriate topic for your informative speech to teach us more about it. Perhaps you want to convince us that we need to learn more about that topic, or that we should take some sort of action based on that particular topic, or at least support some particular belief. And you can be as controversial or as non-controversial as you'd like. The strengths and weaknesses of controversial versus non-controversial, I guess, sort of cancel each other out. I've heard many a speech about non-controversial topics, eating better, for instance, exercising, that really aren't that effective, because it's not that you are dealing with a belief system that's highly unlikely to change, or a value system that's highly unlikely to change. It's getting people's behavior to change. So most audience members will agree with you that it's important to exercise and to eat well, but the trick is getting them to actually incorporate those behaviors into their lives. Sometimes it's easier actually to get somebody to take an action than it is to change their belief system. So I might happily take an action like sign a petition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what I believe. I might be signing that petition merely because I don't want to interact with you anymore and I want you to go away, or because I see this as a photo op opportunity and it doesn't necessarily reflect my personal beliefs. So, there are many ways to go about it, and certainly if you're going to choose one of those hot button topics, you know that you want to be respectful to your audience. You want to show ethos or ethics, and the trick is not to have everybody agree with you, but to earn everybody's respect. And I've oftentimes said that I wish our politicians could do as well as the students in my class, and that they show a certain level of respect and reasonableness, my students, that I don't necessarily see in the political realm. So, of course, we talked about the consumer imperative, how important it is not just to give speeches, but to evaluate the speeches of others. And when you're listening to political speeches, you should demand better of your representatives if they aren't necessarily doing what you're required to do, which is to prepare and to be ethical and to make sure that they are being reasonable and rational. Um, if you can, try to refute the opposing side, what I call the elephant in the room, rather than pretending that there isn't an alternate perspective, just acknowledging that. In fact, that's one of the ways that oftentimes is suggested for dealing with hostile audiences. Sometimes they just want to be acknowledged, or at least skeptical audiences. They just want to be acknowledged that their position does exist and might have some element of validity. Although, of course, in your persuasive speech, you don't want to spend so much time talking about the opposition that now you've lost control of your speech. So I always say you're going to have three audiences. The first is the audience that already agrees with your position before you even begin speaking. They should still agree with your position after you're done with your speech, or something has gone terribly wrong. And then there's the position that is the exact opposite. It doesn't matter what you say or do in a speech, they are never going to change their position. Again, the goal is to earn their respect, not necessarily to change their position. And then there's what oftentimes is called the swing vote in the political arena, people who are on the fence. And that's really where you're aiming your argument towards. And that might not necessarily happen immediately. You might just be planting a seed that will lead to a change of behavior or belief system that occurs days, weeks, months, even years after the fact. The outside sources help to enhance your credibility. It's one of the reasons why you're using outside sources. And again, we could spend an entire semester just talking about the ways that we can motivate individuals to engage in behavior or to support positions. But if I were to oversimplify, and the text talks a little bit about this, there are basically three motivators for individuals. The first is affiliation or belonging. We want to belong to part of a group. The second is achievement or success, which in some ways is actually the opposite of belonging. Think about grades, for instance. You don't want to be like everybody else with the C or the B. You want to be the A student. You want to have the best success that you can. And then there's power and control. And just look at advertisements to see how that oftentimes is used to persuade individuals to take behaviors, such as purchasing behaviors, to that particular product that they are advertising. The idea of belonging, when think about the number one car in America, the idea is that you want to belong to that group. Or let's say achievement, success. And again, I'll use cars, one of the more expensive purchases you'll make in a lifetime. Achievement or success, the idea that if you're driving a particular vehicle, chances are that shows that you've maintained a certain level of income and achieved a certain level of success. You'll oftentimes see that with the attire the driver is wearing, the home perhaps that the car pulls up to, things of that nature. And also power and control, that you may not be able to control the outside world, but within the vehicle itself, it becomes a self-contained environment that you can control. So there is one other way to motivate individuals that is very effective, but also very dangerous: fear. And again, we've seen how our media has oftentimes used that as well. Use very cautiously, because fear interferes with reasoning. And again, you have to think about the motivators. So I think about how sometimes fear is used, for instance, for something like health benefits. And perhaps that justifies using fear, that if you were to smoke too many cigarettes, there is the possibility of getting cancer. But of course, what you don't want to do is to create fear merely for creating fear. And that's, again, what our media oftentimes does. And I teach a class in the media, so we talk about this. So there was a theorist named Monroe. He came up with a sequence that you usually utilize when you are trying to motivate an individual to support a position or to take an action. It really is what we've been talking about all semester long, but he gets credit for it because he actually wrote it down. So it's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence, that you need to get your audience's attention. You need to show that there's some sort of need for change. You need to show how you can satisfy that need, at least partially, through your suggestions. Visualize for your audience how things could be better with your suggestions. And then if there's a call for action, if you want the audience to do something, then you can do that then. Basically, what you're doing is you're putting forth an argument. We talk about arguments a lot in college, and I'm not talking about a fight. I'm talking about putting forth a claim, a position in which you show evidence and some sort of reasoning pattern. And claims, there are lots of different claims you can make, and all of them, in fact, have strengths and weaknesses to them. Think about something like a claim of fact, that something is or is not the case. That would seem to be non-debatable, but it could be. GCC is a small school, is a claim of fact. But of course, in reference to what? GCC is a small school in reference to some schools, but it could be a large school in reference to other schools. Or how about a claim of value, that something is good or bad? And that could be very subjective, that what one person thinks is good, another person thinks is bad. How about that GCC is a good school? Think about the idea of how do you measure that? Do you measure that through surveys? Do you measure that through graduation rates? Do you do some sort of combination of the two? These are sort of the things that we were talking about in terms of using outside resources. And a claim of policy, when you are suggesting a course of action. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program, and we used to have one. It was eliminated because of financial concerns, and I guess we could debate back and forth whether that elimination actually saved money, or did it cost ultimately more money because we would have lost students who would have been interested in enrolling because of the sports program. And we'll never know until we actually institute it. So, when you engage in reasoning, there's lots of different kinds of reasoning that you can engage in. There are whole classes in logic about this. But if you're using inductive reasoning, you're using examples. Medical studies are a great example, that there are enough examples there for you to be able to make a determination about, let's say, whether or not a drug is effective. And you know that sometimes those studies can be incorrect. So inductive reasoning isn't always correct. There's also deductive reasoning, which is a generalization that comes from all of these examples. So think about the idea that college leads to success, which is often the case, but not always the case. Or reasoning from sign, there's an observable mark. So for instance, if you have a sore throat, that's an observable sign, perhaps, that you're going to get a head cold. Of course, it can mean other things as well, but perhaps you've had enough examples of that happening so that you could draw a generalization, so that whenever you have a sore throat, you can think this feels like other sore throats in the past, and it looks like I'm getting a head cold. And again, it's not foolproof, but the idea is that you're trying to use some sort of logic. And you can have all kinds of errors in reasoning. We do this all the time. And what you want to do is to be aware, so that when you are listening to the speeches of others, you can identify their errors in reasoning. And when you are putting forth arguments yourself, you're trying to avoid errors in reasoning. This too is a class in and of itself, but some errors in reasoning, as you can see in the second section in the notes below. A hasty generalization. So you're making an assumption based on too little evidence. I always think about how I talk about this at the ending of the semester, which means that a new semester is beginning, which means choices have to be made about which classes might need to be canceled because they don't have sufficient enrollment. And of course, those are very complicated choices that I'm so glad I don't have to make. But you need to ask yourself, is it that a class doesn't have enough enrollment because of the class? Or is it because of the teacher? Or is it because of the time? Or is it because of another variable that we aren't considering it? Appeal to ignorance. In other words, prove me wrong. And you'll see this a lot also in the media. The burden of responsibility is not on the audience. The burden of responsibility should be on the speaker. So, for instance, I could tell you that I'm a space alien from Mars, and I could argue that until you prove that I'm not, I am, which is absurd. The burden of proof is on me to prove that I am a space alien, not on you to prove that I'm not a space alien. The bandwagon fallacy, advertisers will use this often. Join the crowd, be like everybody else, or what I call the teenage argument. Everybody else is going to the party, I want to go as well. The sequential fallacy, that there's a direct correlation between cause and effect. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps you did poorly on the quiz because you were ill. So that's a cause and effect. Or perhaps you did poorly on the quiz because you always do poorly on quizzes regardless of your health. So the idea that you had a cold is irrelevant. So again, it can be very difficult to separate the two. One thing I've noticed, if things are going well in the economy, the political party in charge will take credit. If things are going poorly in the economy, the political party in charge will blame other forces. So the idea of begging the question, rephrasing the question, circular reasoning. In other words, what is empathic listening? It's listening with empathy. That was a quiz question, by the way. And what you've just done is rephrase the question. You have not answered the question. You need to define empathy, which is being emotionally supportive in this instance. Again, politicians will oftentimes do such a thing as rephrasing questions. Appeal to authority, which sounds like it has a certain level of validity. The problem is the authority. And the authority is usually a celebrity or somebody who's popular, not necessarily somebody who has expertise. So perhaps, a celebrity who's trying to sell, let's say, a long distance phone plan, that singer may not have any kind of expertise whatsoever in long distance phone plans. But the idea is that if you happen to like that singer and you might ultimately want to be like them, or at least follow their advice, which means that you're going to follow their advice for a long distance phone plan, because that's what they use, even though they know absolutely nothing about long distance phone plans. Again, you'll oftentimes see this with commercials. Name calling, attacking the individual, what I call the schoolyard argument. We're not supposed to attack our opponents. But again, we see this more and more as our political structure becomes more and more tense. The idea of a genetic fallacy, that you continue past practice just because it's past practice. And there's a certain element of I believe, validity to the idea of following past practice. It's what our legal system is based on. But I think about this in the workplace, where you might ask, why are we doing this process? And the response might be, well, we've always done it that way. That's not a good reason that you've always done it that way. That's not the justification to continue to do it that way. So I wanted you in the notes below, in the second section, there's an article from Diverse Education that talks a little bit about how a situation occurred where name calling, in particular, an attack on an individual, happened, but there were other errors in reasoning as well. And I was able to find a video on YouTube of about a minute or so of what occurred. So I'm giving that to you so that you can watch it. And basically, what's happening here is that you've got two professors who are the advisors for two debate teams at two different colleges. And the two teams are competing against one another. Both of these coaches have competed against one another before and have some bad blood between them. And ultimately, the debate just degenerated into a shouting match between the two coaches, where profanity was thrown back and forth and insults. And one coach actually mooned the other coach, though we could debate as to whether or not it was a true mooning because underwear was still on. And to complicate matters, to make it even more complex, one of the coaches was a Caucasian male, and the other coach was a black female, and the debate topic was about race relations. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I don't want you to watch this because we want to see who was right or who was wrong, or what happened. I wanted to show you this in the context of how easy it is to make an error in reasoning. Obviously, these debate coaches have devoted their careers to communication and rhetoric and public speaking and debate, and very well esteemed, both of them. But if you push the right buttons, it becomes very easy to let emotion get in the way of reasoning and intellect. So I show this to you as a kind of cautionary tale to not allow something like that to happen. The story with this is that it was recorded. It wasn't supposed to be recorded, but of course, in our digital age, it's not difficult to record. Posted on YouTube. It eventually led to the firing of one coach, the Caucasian male, and a suspension for the other coach, the black female. And again, I don't want to debate as to whether or not the punishments were fair or unfair. What's more interesting to me is how you can have two people who basically are highly educated and are professionals engage in this kind of behavior, worse, in a public forum in front of students. And of course, they were recorded. And as hard as they've tried to get this video removed from YouTube, it keeps showing up here, there, and everywhere. So the video I'm sharing with you, at least as of the point that I am posting this, is for you to be able to see what ends up happening. So in terms of thinking about speech number 2 with peer feedback, please send one strength and one weakness, as you have done with the autobiographical speech, of each of your peers' speech number 2 to my email, so we can maintain a certain level of privacy. That's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by Friday, 1/17. Note the extension of 48 hours rather than 24 hours because we've got the time. Again, if you need additional time, let me know. And I'll put a sample persuasive speech up for you to view next class if it turns out that you wanted to get a sense of how to go about persuasive speech. It'll be from Toastmasters, actually, a member of Toastmasters. You'll remember that that was the organization that was devoted to helping people improve their public speaking skills. So, and as with every speech, it has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. This speech happens to be that I'll be posting next class with the quiz. It happens to be about eating organic foods. The context of it is that it sounds like the speaker, we don't see the audience. It sounds like the speaker is speaking to an audience as they're eating themselves, probably a luncheon, because oftentimes Toastmasters utilize social events like that in order to be able to have audiences to present their speeches. And you'll see that the speaker doesn't use any audio visuals, wasn't required to use any audio visuals probably, but oh, what a missed opportunity when people are eating to actually be able to show examples of food. Organic and non-organic, so as you will see when you see that sample speech. So that said, I just thought that you might want to use a persuasive speech, but there are lots of possibilities for your persuasive speech. And considering the very short timeline, you might want to think about perhaps something that you've talked about in previous speeches. You might want to talk about perhaps something that you debate frequently with family and friends, lowering the cost of textbooks, or putting a stop sign at a particular intersection, or again, some of those hot button topics that we oftentimes have some hesitancy to discuss. But if we can't discuss them in an academic form, I don't know where we can discuss them. And you're not required to use audio visuals, by the way, for your last speech, but As you probably found with your second speech, it certainly helps when you're trying to teach your audience something. So you might elect to use audio visuals, but what I've done is I've divided up all three speeches so that they're different skill areas. I suppose the most realistic speech would be where you combine all of them together and you were to give, let's say, something like a half-hour speech where you use audio visuals and you talk a little bit about yourself and you use outside resources, and you aren't necessarily told how to balance all of that. You're just given a time frame of about a half hour, and when you speak in the public, then ultimately you get to make the decisions of how you're going to go about presenting that kind of information. But I wanted to divide things up into pieces for this particular class so that you could focus on particular skills. So again, next class, which will be Thursday, you'll have quiz number 3. I will post that practice speech for you to take a peek at from a member of Toastmasters talking about organic foods. And we can have an optional practice session. And then on Friday the 17th, we won't have a class because it's catch-up class, but you should be handing in your informative speech peer feedbacks to me just so that I can gather all of that and post it. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with quiz 3. Take care. Bye-bye.